Okay, in this video we'll go over the installation of the drive. Now today I'm going to be installing this Armor PowerFlex on a trade show demo. This particular trade show demo is going to be utilizing some hardwired I/O. I'm going to be using start, stop, and clear fault buttons there on the top. I'm going to be using network safety. I'm going to be using safe stop 1 as well as safe limited speed. And I'm also going to incorporate this door switch, which will simulate opening an enclosure door. Inside the enclosure is what the drive's actually going to be powering. It's a simple conveyor belt. So let's talk about wiring it up, running your line power to it. At the bottom here you've got line power coming in, and behind this cover is where the actual connections are for your line cable. So we'll go ahead and take that cover off. So here you can see you've got your 3 phases for your incoming line. You've got L1, L2, L3 on the left hand side there, as well as ground. If I was going to power another device off of this in a pigtail design, I would bring its connections up through that connector there and have its 3 phases connected and its ground. Above that I've got the fuses for the incoming line as well as the fuses for the EM brake. Now the motor connector here, since this drive has a built-in EM brake, it's got 2 extra conductors for the EM brake, but since I'm not going to be using that, I'll just disregard those 2 connectors. But the motor would connect there. I'm using a simple 4-pole 60 Hz motor with a gearbox and an incremental encoder. Dynamic brake would connect here. Since I'm using a gearbox which is geared pretty low, I'm going to have very minimal regen, so I don't need a dynamic brake. That's why I've got it capped off. Now as far as control power, this drive's got the built-in control power supply, but if I was going to use auxiliary power, I'd have 2 connections there where I would wire my aux power supply to. Again, I'm going to be using an incremental encoder, an A quad B encoder. It's going to wire right there on the encoder connection. When the drive ships from the factory, it ships with this safety plug. So since I'm using safety, hardwired safety or network safety, if you're not using either one, you insert the plug into input 0 and 1. But since I am using safety, I'm going to remove the plug, but I'll still hold on to the plug. Now as far as the safety I/O cables, it's standard safety I/O cable. They come in 2 different configurations. You can get a 90-degree or a straight cable. I'm going to be using 2 inputs today and 1 output. The encoder cable, the pinout for the encoder cable is in the technical data manual. The encoder cable would connect right to that encoder connection point on the front. Now behind this cover here is where I would set the IP address. So it's got thumbnail switches that I can set, and when I use the thumbnail switches, it'll set the last octet of a 192.168.1 IP address. So once the cover is off, the 3 thumbnail switches on the right hand side will set that last octet. There's also fuses in here for your internal control power supply, and there's a switch there in the middle for the encoder voltage. You can do 12 volt or 5 volt encoders. I'm going to be using a 12 volt encoder today. Now continuing further on, I've got my Gigabit Ethernet ports. It's a dual port setup. I'm going to be only using 1. I'm using A1, so I've got A2 capped off. The Gigabit Ethernet requires a special plug, and they have a converter cable which will convert a Meg Ethernet cable to a Gigabit Ethernet cable, which is what I'm utilizing for this drive. And above that you've got your standard I/O. I'm going to be using 2 inputs today, no outputs, and so standard I/O cable, same as the safety I/O cable where you can get it in a straight configuration or a 90-degree configuration. So I'll go ahead and start wiring things up. In the next video we'll go ahead and power it up and actually watch it run.